Well, thank you. Thank you, Kim Quebe, for that introduction. I just want to mention that the first time that I met Kim Quebe was at another conference a few months ago, and I was the one that introduced him when he gave his presentation, and now he's introduced me, so I think we're equal now. So good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be invited here to this Interregional Memory of the World Conference to give you an update on progress with an international preservation project for digital material called PERSIST, and in particular with the content selection guidelines that were developed as part of this project. Okay, so Dr. Fang has already talked about the PERSIST project, and I will just add a few additional comments for you today. The genesis of PERSIST was an international conference organized by UNESCO with a global team of cultural and memory institutions and associations on the topic of our digital heritage. It was held in 2012 in my hometown, Vancouver, Canada, so I had a big part to play in organizing this international conference with UNESCO at the time. But it's important to note that it took a strategic, high-level view of digital preservation, and it focused on the importance of developing policies, technical approaches, and best practices related to digital content and description. We had several discussions since 2014 about PERSIST. Where should it belong in the network of digital preservation activities? And so just recently, as Dr. Fang mentioned, we got approval that PERSIST will reside in the Memory of the World program, merging with the long-standing Subcommittee on Technology to form the new Preservation Subcommittee. And I'm pleased to say that Dr. Fang has become the first chair of that new Preservation Subcommittee. Now, one point that I always stress when I talk about PERSIST, it's that it's a three-way partnership. Not only are cultural and memory institutions key players in PERSIST, but governments at national and international levels, and the information computer industry also. They have to be participants. They have to be with us when we talk about digital preservation if we ever hope to advance a sustainable and effective preservation network in the world for digital material. And so we established 3 working groups in 2014, and out of the Content and Best Practices Working Group came the guidelines for the selection of digital heritage for long-term preservation, which is the main topic of this session. So I don't think I need to convince any of you that the deluge of digital information is flowing all around us on the internet. But just as we don't know how many fish there are in the oceans and rivers around us, we really don't know how much digital data and information is out there. But we do know that it's growing fast, exponentially fast. Will it be possible to capture and preserve all that data? Some people have argued that it would be a good thing to sweep everything up now, and in the future, some new generation of computers and artificial intelligence will be able to make sense of it all. Now, that's a very common topic that we hear. But more and more, I think this point of view of gathering, harvesting everything now is probably losing a lot of supporters at the moment. So why don't we collect everything? Well, for one thing, information professionals have always been selecting materials for long-term access in the print world. For example, archivists have always had a very logical and orderly process to appraise archival records and to schedule retention schedules on an ongoing basis. But in the digital era, there are 2 major reasons why it is really impossible to collect and save all digital information. The first reason is simply the sheer volume of information that cultural and heritage institutions must deal with. According to David Rosenthal from Stanford University, a few years ago, he said that data creation increases by about 60% a year, and digital storage capacity increases by about 40% a year. And I'm sure that these numbers are probably much higher today. And yet, if I look at library budgets, they increase by a paltry 2% a year, if that. So library budgets are really not capable of supporting the increasing volume of digital information. And when I say library budget, I also mean archives budget, museums budgets, all the cultural heritage institutions. And then there are technical issues, such as software failure and physical media obsolescence, which adds to the cost of managing digital information over the long term. The result is we are facing a sustainability crisis. So in the words of William Kilbride, the executive director of the Digital Preservation Coalition, who has done a lot of research in this area, he said, unless we do selection to weed out something, we can't preserve anything. Given this state of affairs, the PERSIST Content and Best Practices Working Group set out to develop some meaningful and we hope some useful selection guidelines for digital preservation. The guidelines were written and launched in 2016 by a cross-sector working group led by IFLA. This was completed after several surveys and studies were done to provide a broader picture of the digital preservation environment at that time. Now, the guidelines are written at a high level, and they're intended to inform and provide direction to national and local digital preservation policies and guidelines, how they are developed. You know, it's impossible to write strict rules for what to preserve, since every cultural institution has its own context in which it operates, which will affect decisions made about what resources should be preserved. As Dr. Fang mentioned, the guidelines have been translated into 8 languages so far. These are on the IFLA website, and they're also on the UNESCO-PERSIST website. And I just want to add to the list, coming soon, we're in discussions to get the guidelines translated into Romanian and into Farsi. So I'd like to turn now to describing some of the major highlights of the selection guidelines. Evaluating and assessing digital heritage should be based on many of the same principles that underlie selection of traditional analog materials. But they also must now consider new issues of long-term accessibility, use, and preservation in making selection decisions. So the working group identified 3 major criteria against which to base selection decisions. The first and the most important, I think, is the significance of the digital heritage to an institution's mandate and the public it serves. Some questions to ask here in considering whether to preserve a digital object or not are, does the digital object have significant social, cultural, historic, or artistic value for the community served by the institution? And how will the institution's stakeholders, its clients, its sponsors, society, how will they be affected if this digital heritage is not preserved? The second criteria is sustainability. Does the institution have the capacity, sufficient budget, and resources to preserve the digital object for long-term access and use? Does the institution have the technical capacity to read, migrate, and preserve the digital object? Is sufficient metadata available to access over time this digital heritage? And the third criteria is availability. Availability refers to which other institutions in the heritage community or network are collecting and preserving digital resources. Is the digital object rare or unique, or is it widely duplicated? In which institution or region will the object be of most use or most benefit to the public? Is it at risk at other institutions? This criteria assumes that the host institution has some knowledge of what others are doing in their digital environment. So these are the three main criteria that we felt were the most impactful and would achieve the best results in making preservation decisions. But it's also important to mention that there are no set rules or instructions to help you make your selection decision. These criteria are meant to be flexible. For example, as you can expect, what object, digital or not, is significant to one institution may not be significant to another. So the selection decision depends on the context, on the type of institution, its mandate, and often on its geographic location and geopolitical environment. Now, to these three criteria in the guidelines, I've added two other words that were noted by, again, William Kilbride at a previous conference, and these are people and opportunity. Selection for preservation is not only about bits and bytes or about data or even about access itself, but it's about the value of the digital object and its impact on the health and the purpose of the organization. We should continue to select material for preservation, keeping people and opportunity in mind, so as to ensure a meaningful and secure digital heritage for our communities. So once the selection criteria are considered and appropriate questions about whether to preserve a digital object or not are made, the guidelines then offer a decision tree approach to assist your institutions in making the appropriate decision for selection. There is also a section in the guidelines that outlines the importance of creating a complete and accurate metadata set that is really essential to ensure that the digital material being preserved is and remains accessible, intelligible, and usable over time. If the digital heritage is the content, then the metadata is the context. And finally, the guidelines describe the impact that the legal environment can have on the selection of digital objects for preservation. And again, this legal environment will vary by country and by jurisdiction. If, for example, your institution has a legal obligation to collect and preserve the digital object over the long term, then there's no need to go further in using the guidelines to make your decision. But like so many cases in the digital ecosystem, answers are often not black and white, and the professional judgment of many people will need to be applied to make the correct decision about whether to preserve a digital resource or not. So we've done some analysis of the usage statistics for the selection guidelines. And while I can state very honestly that the guidelines have not yet become number one on the bestseller lists, we have seen more than 600 downloads of the guidelines from the IFLA website and from all continents in the past 2 years. And in addition, the UNESCO-PERSIST website has also seen many downloads. And as I mentioned before, these selection guidelines are at general high level, meant to guide institutions and individuals to develop their own selection policies for digital preservation. The guidelines have also been used for training purposes globally, an example being the workshops that UNESCO hosts in many parts of the world to promote digital preservation and access, as expressed in the 2015 recommendation that we heard about before. But while still very useful, it is a fact that the guidelines were written 4 years ago. And we know that 4 years is a long time, a very long time, when we speak about digital development. There are many new formats of digital documents that are being created and included in cultural heritage institutions' collections. For example, ephemeral material, which is best described in the digital world as social media content, probably outnumbers more traditional e-books and e-journals. Software has itself become an object to collect and preserve. And we recognize that inclusiveness and diversity in our communities are not well reflected in the current edition of the guidelines. And from a moral and ethical perspective, there are several internal and external factors that impact an institution's decision related whether to keep the object for long-term or to be deleted forever. We are also much more connected now as a community. You can just look at us here. We're a community of practitioners so that there could be more coordination of selection choices. And speaking of the future, for a future edition, plans have already started to set up a review group to update the guidelines. And here's a draft of the terms of reference for the new working group that will be set up. It will review the strengths and weaknesses of the guidelines, the current edition, identify any gaps, and then prepare the next edition. The time frame is from now until December 2020. So we haven't made any decisions yet on membership of the group. But as for the first edition, we expect that review group members will come from libraries, archives, and museums, as well as from the software and data community, possibly from other digital preservation networks, such as the Digital Preservation Coalition, and perhaps from other sectors as well. And of course, UNESCO will be an ex officio member on the group as before. So finally, I would like to ask for your help. Being in Asia now, it is an opportune time to seek out volunteers from this area to translate the current guidelines into additional languages from this region that would assist cultural heritage institutions in making good preservation decisions. And you know, really, it's not too onerous of a task. The guidelines are 19 pages. So it's not like you have to translate for a whole month. I'm sure that you could do it quite quickly if you decide to do a translation. And also we're asking for volunteers, potential members, to add to the new working group, the review group, to bring expertise, especially from Asian countries, to make the working group more global in its perspective. And if you are interested in either the translation option or the review group option, I'd be happy to speak to you after the session. And it goes without saying that the promotion of the selection guidelines in your countries and regions is really essential to ensure that our precious digital heritage is well preserved and accessible for future generations. You know, in my participation with the PERSIST project over the last 6 years, I've noted that the greatest hurdle to overcome in ensuring long-term preservation is not really the technical challenges, nor is it necessarily the financial implications, but rather it is all about raising awareness to governments, to civil societies, and to the ICT industries that our digital heritage, our identities as human and social communities, will be in danger if we do not have the ability and the determination to be creative in undertaking sustainable preservation activities. And just as a thought too, I had that, you know, what we're trying to do now with digital preservation is very similar to the topic of climate change that the world is talking about now, to the increasing efforts being made to raise awareness of what could happen if we do not take preventative measures now. And likewise, the preservation of cultural heritage, it's our duty as information professionals to pursue that activity as much as we can. So let us keep up the momentum and the advocacy for a sustainable and accessible digital future for all of us. Thank you, and 감사합니다.